Good evening. Clearly, we are not getting quite the same situation as much of the United States. However, the number of daily new COVID-19 cases in Victoria remains stubbornly high, with the single largest increase in a day recorded just this morning of 532 new cases. Do we just need more time for lockdowns and masks to work, or are other further urgent measures needed to curb the spread of this virus?
Bill Bowtell, are we dealing with this urgently enough?
No, we're not. And I think at the outset we've got to differentiate between what's happening in Victoria and New South Wales and what's happening in the other states of Australia and New Zealand. If you take Australia and New Zealand together, about 30 million people. Now tonight, more than half of that number are living in COVID-free jurisdictions because they saw the problem for what it was, and one way or another they've got to a situation where they've eliminated community transmission. So we're not talking about an Australia-wide problem, we're talking about a problem that's emerged in Victoria and in New South Wales, where the strategic decision was not taken, as it was in the outlying states in New Zealand, to eliminate local transmission. Now, the virus will find the weakest link, and because we didn't have that strategic goal, the virus has found a way to come back. We were too quick to come out of the lockdown, the first one. We did not advocate strongly enough the use of masks in the transition, and here we are. It's a very serious situation in Victoria, and I hope not as serious in New South Wales, but we cannot keep on doing this. We have to stop this thing here and now.
Just to be clear, is it getting away from us in your view?
Well, at 350 cases a day, yes it is. 350 cases a day, 2,000 a week. That means there's a proportion of those cases who are people now who are very ill, who may be requiring hospitalisation, and a proportion of those who are seriously ill. Now, that imposes immense strains on our healthcare workers, from ambulance drivers all the way through to the doctors, the nurses, the hospital staff, and so on, and by implication their families. So this is not a good situation, and it's good to see that the Premier, the Prime Minister, all the resources, the money, the intellectual effort, the facilities are going to knock this down. So that's good, that's tremendous, and we've all got to get behind that and bring it down. The question is, though, do we bring it down to the same low level we had a few weeks ago in Victoria and New South Wales, and then go into another cycle of rinse and repeat and have a lockdown 3 come at Christmas? I'd rather this Christmas was COVID-free in New South Wales and Victoria, like we hope it will be and remain to be so in the rest of the country and New Zealand. We have a choice now in front of us. The experiment's been run in real time from March through till August now, and we know what works and we know what doesn't work so well. So let's get on with it and let's just knock this thing out.
Gigi Foster?
Completely disagree. I feel that, in fact, it's a fantasy to believe that we can, in fact, eliminate this virus, whether just in Victoria and New South Wales or across all of Australia. And there's no real end game in sight. If we did eliminate it, then we would have to commit ourselves to living basically isolated from the rest of the world until such time as there was a vaccine or some other brilliant discovery came about that would protect us, you know, ad infinitum against this thing. And I just think that's an unrealistic vision. I think that Australia can follow in the footsteps of many other countries in the world, some of which have not had lockdowns as strict as we've had here, such as, again, Sweden, and look at the death tolls in those countries that have had proper first waves.
Let me pull you up there. Yes. Sweden has had 5,697 deaths.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Are you comfortable with advocating that for Australia?
I am comfortable with saying, let's be data-driven in our policy choices. Let's look at what's happened in other countries. Sweden, yes, asymptoting death count to about 6,000. In the UK, asymptoting to about 50,000. But the economic
payoff is not there currently. GDP is down almost 7% in Sweden. Unemployment is at 9% as of May.
Yeah.
I mean, the advantage is not there.
Well, it's very, very early days, first of all. And secondly, we're also having huge economic costs here. And these costs are going to be with us for a generation, Hamish. And people are
But how can you point to Sweden and say there's the model?
Well, if you look at what's now happening, again, to those death counts, right? They're asymptoting around the world in every country that's had a proper first wave to somewhere between 0.05% and 0.1% of the population. That translates in Australia to about 12,000 to 25,000 deaths of people who are predominantly elderly and or immunocompromised, but it's a body count. Now, if we were to let this virus do what it has done in Sweden, which was by no means a no restriction situation, there were definitely restrictions on what people could do. There was endogenous reaction by people. They chose to do things differently. If we had that sort of death count here, that would be about 12,000 to 25,000.
In Victoria today, there were 6 further deaths announced. There are 44 people tonight in ICU, 245 people in hospital. I mean, this is just heartless.
It's horrible, and it's horrible what is happening to people.
Why are you advocating for them to die?
I'm not advocating for anybody to die. I'm advocating for the least people to die as possible. Because what we're talking about now, what Bill was just talking about, is exclusively about COVID-19 related deaths and suffering. What about everything else that kills people and makes them suffer? My position is that we should consider all of the things that influence human welfare, human livelihoods, lives and quality of lives, whether it's COVID-19 or something else. Have we even thought about the costs of the mental stress and anguish, the unemployment effects? There's new information coming out of the UK that's indicated a huge drop in life satisfaction starting in March. If we translate that to the Australian population, we'd be talking about a loss of about 100,000 life years, healthy life years, sacrificed for every month of lockdown here. And that's just mental stress.
Can I say, Hamish, that we represent thousands of community organisations on the ground around the country who are doing everything they can to keep people safe, to protect people from the ravages of what happens when you lose your job. It is an extremely serious situation, but there is no question for us that the protecting people's health and saving people's lives is paramount, and it goes hand in hand with delivering on us getting to the other side of what might be jobs growth. You can't separate this out. The reality is the economy is a group of people. People are making the best decisions they can at the moment, overwhelmingly trying to look after their friends, their loved ones, to try and keep the jobs and business doors open. But at the end of the day, whilst this virus is with us, we have to keep focusing on getting the strong health outcomes and that kind of determination to deal with this, because otherwise confidence, which is the buzzword, the key word on the economy, is absolutely undermined here. And of course, we totally reject this notion that somehow some lives are worth trading off in this debate.
Let me bring George in. You're in Melbourne. Sitting in Melbourne where the daily death count does seem to be growing, how do you hear Gigi's argument?
I'll put an economics cap on. Let's assume the market can efficiently allocate death, which is what Gigi's arguing. I'd argue that it couldn't, because the minute you let a virus run free, the minute a government says you're on your own, you get locked down anyway. Yep. So consumers avoid shops, they avoid mass gatherings. The second thing that happens if you were to take a let it rip strategy is that the hospital system couldn't cope. And then hospitals are incentivised to not let in people with COVID because it's going to overwhelm their doctors and nurses and orderlies and other workers in the hospital. The idea that there is a trade-off makes no economic sense to me, because it's like pretending that you have a pandemic but it's still 2019 if you don't have any restrictions. Australians actually did demonstrate in the first wave, in the first lockdown, that they're quite willing to be led on this stuff, and we're actually pretty good at flattening that curve the first time around. Obviously, there's been an extraordinary blunder in Victoria and an extraordinary series of unlucky events in Victoria too. So, when you look at sort of responsibility, I'm not in the blame game. When you're looking at responsibility, there are things that were avoidable, and there are some things that probably couldn't have been foreseen in Victoria, and that's that the thing would move as quickly as it did through the community. But as I say, the idea that the market could allocate death better than a health intervention from the government, which prioritises the good health of the country over everything else, just doesn't add up to me. But it doesn't add up to me as an economist, because every other country that's sort of tried to let it rip, and there's a guy called Donald Trump who's already given up on this idea. It took him 6 months to give up on this idea, but he's just cancelled, just this week, his convention in Florida. Why? Because no one will go to that event because they don't trust the thing while it's still out there, that is the virus, and if the government doesn't have their back, people won't go out anyway. So, look, I want to stay in my lane and talk about Victoria when I get the chance, but just the economic argument doesn't add up to me because you can't just say, I'll cop 25,000 deaths and I'll avoid another 30. It's just not the way the world works.
That's true, isn't it, Gigi?
I mean, the 20,000 versus 30 is exactly, you're making my argument. It's the 20,000 we're giving up. If you've heard of the trolley problem, right? The trolley problem was where there's a trolley going along and it's going to hit 10 people unless you change it to the track that hits 1. And you can look that one person in the eyes, you know exactly who that person is. Do you change the track? I change the track.
Bill?
Well, the evidence has been run in real time. The Swedish example is a fiasco. The Prime Minister of Sweden the other day apologised for what had happened. 2,000 Swedish expert epidemiologists, economists announced what had happened. The economic outcomes in Sweden were no better or worse than their neighbouring countries. The idea of locking old people in aged care homes, not allowing them to be treated in hospitals, as became the norm in Sweden, is, or should be, abhorrent. The job of governments is to make people's lives healthier, wealthier, happier. You cannot segment out one sector of the population and ask them to undergo great misery, suffering, death, in the interests, the spurious interests of saying all the rest of us will benefit. That is not how societies work. And it should not work in Australia. It can be discounted. The evidence is overwhelmingly clear. The debate, in my view, is finished. We've just got to get on with the job of doing in New South Wales and Victoria what has been done in the outlying states in New Zealand. Where would you rather be tonight if you're in a job in a restaurant owner in Melbourne? Would you rather be opening up tomorrow in Melbourne or in Auckland? Where would the customers of that restaurant rather be? In Melbourne or in Auckland? I think they'd rather be in a COVID-free environment.
Bill would be the first person to say, though, that we've got to make sure that if you are losing your job, that you're going to be okay.